Welcome again to Profiles on Nantucket Community Television, Channel 18. I'm Charlie Walters. To visit or to live on Nantucket is to be constantly aware of the island's natural and architectural beauty, as well as its history. Many organizations, both private and governmental, work to preserve these qualities. One of those governmental entities, and it's one that's not well enough known, is the Nantucket Historical Commission, not to be confused with the Historic District Commission. I'm pleased today to have with me in the studio the chair of the Nantucket Historical Commission, Hillary Hedges Rayport. Thank you for coming in.
Thank you for having me, Charlie. It's great to be here.
Before we talk, I'm just going to read the Commission's mission statement. It's only 2 sentences and it comes off the town website, but this will give people a jumping off point for what they're about to hear. The Nantucket Historical Commission is the local historic preservation and archaeology planning and advocacy agency. The NHC creates educational opportunities, creates plans for the preservation of Nantucket, advocates through the Board of Selectmen, now the Select Board, on issues of historic preservation and oversees state requirements for archaeology. Give us a brief history of the commission.
Yes, so the Historical Commission was created in 2005 by an act at town meeting. And it's a portion of Massachusetts general law that Nantucket chose to adopt. It's a little different than the Historic District Commission because the Historic District Commission was created in the 1950s. I think it was 1955 was actually the first act. And it was a special act because as just one of the first couple historic districts in the country, that legislation hadn't been created and broadly adopted across Massachusetts. So Nantucket created its own legislation, its own special law for that.
And this had to be voted on Beacon Hill.
Yes, and it's a special act. But since then, the Massachusetts general law has adopted a historic district law. So if all of the other historic districts in Massachusetts, and I think there are over 200 of them,
really?
Yes, that are historic districts, they don't all have a commission that are active with them, but they're protected areas. And they follow Massachusetts general law, but Nantucket and Beacon Hill being the first, they were created simultaneously. They follow their own special act. But what happened, and you know, I've talked with a number of the people who were on the Historical Commission in its first incarnation. I haven't spoken with all of them, and I wasn't really active with the commission or aware of it when this was happening. But there was a need for more of the preservation planning angle. The Historic District Commission's primary work concerns design review. They're a permitting organization, so you can't get a building permit if you are doing something in the public way, and it's not a repair in kind unless you have a certificate of appropriateness. So that's granted by the HDC. And they review over 1,000 of them every year. So they're incredibly busy. They meet every week on Tuesdays. They have usually a 4, sometimes a 5-hour meeting doing design review. And that's been happening for a very long time. And the sense of the community was there was archaeological assets that weren't being cataloged or looked after, and there was a role for more of a preservation planning organization. So if you want to think about what's different between the HDC and the NHC, you can think about design review and building and approval, granting certificate of appropriateness, granting those certificates, versus just longer term preservation planning, thinking about policies, thinking about archaeology, thinking about research, and also thinking about designations. So our enabling legislation allows us to propose certain buildings for historic designation. Nantucket is extraordinarily well protected because the entire island is a historic district, and also the entire island is a National Historic Landmark. It really just puts a fine point that it's not just the individual structures, but it's the entire context, it's the entire environment that's special about Nantucket The historic landmark application that was made in the 70s and written by Clay Lancaster talks about the special visual quality of the entire island. So all of this is noted, and it does afford us certain protections, but the historic commission, the historical commission, is able to look at certain buildings. We don't do this yet, but we might in the future make something a landmark building. We can extend these sorts of designations.
Well, to put it another way, if you want to paint your house purple,
Yeah, it's not going to happen.
or white, but the HDC would say yes or no to that application.
Yes.
And they have, the regulatory backup, is that the right way to put it? If you paint your house purple, they can come after you.
Yes, they have the power to institute a fine, and it's quite a strict fine. It's $300 a day, and every day is a new offense. So,
But you don't have that power with the historical
No, we don't
commission.
have a power of fining, and we don't have the power of permitting. So, when we reformed the historical commission, I went to talk to a lot of people. I talked to a lot of people before we formed it to advocate for why Nantucket needed it to be reformed, and I also talk to a lot of people to build relationships and work with other commissions. There are a lot of other commissions and committees and advisory boards, all mostly volunteer. I just say, we have no power. The truth is we have no power. The power that we have, we create by doing good work, by being intelligent, considered, and making good recommendations.
Now, as you said, this commission's been around for 15 plus years. But until about 6 months ago, they hadn't met in a couple of years.
Yeah.
So you talked about the reconstitution, the revitalization of the group, which was in the late spring, I think, of this year. So we have an entire new commission? Is it all new members?
Yes, it's 100% a new commission. So the legislation allows for 3 to 7 members, and then alternates on top of that. I think we can have 3 or maybe more alternate members.
And you need alternates because?
We actually have 6 members. It's sort of bittersweet, but Mary Bergman, who was a member of the commission and also our secretary, the sweet part is she's accepted the role as head of the NPT.
Yes.
And the sad part is she felt that she could really be more helpful to the historical commission by not being on the commission. So she's resigned, and the select board has accepted her resignation. So we're 6 members and 2 alternates right now.
And the select board appoints them, or the town
Yes.
manager, or?
Yeah, the select board recommends to the town manager, and the town manager makes the appointments, is actually the way it works. But it's effectively, citizens apply to the select board, and the select board makes the selection.
And you're on for how long?
So the terms are staggered. My term is through 2023, I believe, and because we all came on at the same time, it's staggered terms. So some folks will come off in 2021, 2022, and 2023.
And are you elected the chair by the commission?
Yes,
or you are?
yes, the commission elects its chairs. Mm-hmm.
And who else is on the commission?
Yeah, so we have a wonderful commission. That's another important distinction between the HDC and the NHC. So the HDC is elected, and we're actually the only town in Massachusetts that has an elected HDC. Most HDCs are appointed, and towns handle the appointments in varying ways. They give the power of appointment to different groups in the town to eliminate bias. But we have an elected HDC, and we have an appointed NHC. And our NHC is a wonderful group of people with varying experience. I will say, as far as pure preservation, I'm learning from everyone else. I'm probably the least qualified, self-schooled preservationist on the committee. So our commission consists of Angus MacLeod, who's our vice chair. Angus is an architect. He's practiced for decades on Nantucket. He is on the board of the Nantucket Preservation Trust. He also serves on both the Sconset Advisory Board to the HCC and the Historic Structures Advisory Board. We have another architect, Mickey Rowland. Mickey, also longtime Nantucketer, an architect, and he also serves on the Traffic Safety Advisory Board and the Commission for Disabilities, which he really helped create. So he has a wonderful perspective on the work that we do and on Nantucket. Georgia Raisman is a commissioner. She lives in Sconset seasonally, and she is passionate about preservation on Nantucket. She helped create the Nantucket Preservation Trust. She was president. And she also was instrumental in bringing the concept of the preservation easement or restriction, which has saved a lot of interiors of houses. We have Tom Murray Montgomery on our commission. Tom, I refer to as a man of many talents. He's goes very, very long tenure family history on Nantucket, and he's worked in many different professions, from being a scalloper to being a builder, and he is a determined and dedicated lover of Nantucket and preservationist, and a year-round resident of Nantucket. We have as alternates on our commission Clement Durkees. Clement lives here year-round in Sconset, and she's also the president of the Sconset Preservation Trust. And Don DeMichelle. Don is a newcomer to Nantucket. He's a seasonal resident. He also lives in Naples, Florida. But he has a lot of history in town government. So he's served on the select board of another town he lived in Massachusetts. And he's an executive. So he had senior marketing positions at Procter & Gamble for a long time. So he brings a certain discipline, decision-making skill set to the commission. We also have a young realtor on our commission, David Silver. David is a commissioner, not an alternate, and he works for Maury People. And he's recently graduated from college where he was a history major, and he lives here year-round. And he brings, just a different generational lens, a different aspirational lens, and the real estate perspective. So we have a really well-rounded commission. I mean, their skills were missing on the commission. We have archaeologists, people who are trained archaeologists living on Nantucket and who've served on the commission in the past. And that's something we care a lot about. One of the first things I did when I became a commissioner was I picked up a copy of Abram's Eyes by Nathaniel Philbrick and read it cover to cover with amazing interest.
It's a great book.
Oh my goodness. I mean, Philbrick is such a talented author and storyteller, but the story itself is just heartrending and fascinating. There was a greater density of Native Americans living on Nantucket than anywhere else in New England, and they were here for thousands and thousands of years. So I think most people don't know that, and it's not at all visible except in our names. But there have been some incredible archaeological sites and finds. There's a collection of artifacts at the NHA, and when they built the Pulpus Bike Path, they found the site of a Witu that had been in occupation for hundreds of years. They found layers and layers of artifacts.
Tell us what a Witu is.
A home of the Wampanoag tribe. So I certainly am far, far from as knowledgeable as I should be about the archaeological aspects, but this is one area that's very important to our commission and our mandate that I think we hope to build in the future. It's not well represented on the commission yet.
Well, I know sometimes on Nantucket in the past, coastal erosion has exposed middens or garbage dumps, really. When that happens, do you automatically get a call from someone, or do you have to monitor things to be aware of them?
So we have not gotten a call like that, but I would think that call right now it should go to the state archaeologist. So the directive,
who is not on Nantucket.
Who is not on Nantucket. The directive is if you are a builder and you come upon an artifact or human remains, you should stop what you're doing and call the state archaeologist. But again, this is something I think we need to have a position on, a viewpoint on, and more knowledge about. So maybe after this program we'll get some more calls. I really look forward to that.
Well, I hope so.
Yeah.
I've earmarked some particular places and issues I'd like to get
Sure.
your thoughts on. Milestone Road.
Yeah.
That was a bit of an adventure for Nantucket this summer.
Yes, and ongoing.
What has been going on and why? And
Yeah, so Milestone Road is a project. It's called the Milestone Road Safety and Accessibility Improvement Project. It's using federal funds to improve accessibility through handicap accessible bike paths and improve safety through reflective surfaces and improve signage.
and this being a state highway, the state is involved in
Yes,
this.
it's a state highway and it's a state project. But, you know, at the end of the day, people work with other people, right? So, you know, the teams work closely together. Nantucket is very involved. Nantucket's transportation planner is very involved. And in fact, Nantucket had to be the mover in getting the work done. So Nantucket is very good at getting federal and state funding here to be spent on island.
So even though this is a state highway, the impetus to get these things done, or at least some of them done,
Yes.
came from Nantucket.
Yeah, if Nantucket's transportation planner had not raised his hand and said, hey, what about this project here, and done you have to do a safety audit. So Nantucket did a safety audit of the road. They looked at traffic statistics for a 6-year period and identified areas and opportunities to improve the safety of the road.
There were a lot of signs at one point
Yeah.
along the road.
Yes.
How did that happen?
So this is an important role of the Historical Commission. When Nantucket is a historic landmark. So I think when any kind of building infrastructure is proposed, no matter who's paying for it, there should be a conversation and people should stop and think, how is this affecting our the historic quality, the special visual quality of Nantucket? I think that should always be happening, but it's actually a law that it has to happen if it's federal or state money. So if $1 of state money or federal money is spent to change something or build something on Nantucket, it needs to go through a review, which is called a Section 106 review. And it's part of the Historic Protection Act that was passed in the 1960s. It's a federal law. So the project manager, which in the Milestone Road case was a consulting engineer, manages all of these approvals. So we received a letter, the Historical Commission received a letter. Now, we didn't exist at the time. It was back in 2018, in early 2018, that the letter was sent saying, there's this project on Milestone Road, and here are the project plans, and could you give us your comments? And those comments get forwarded to the Massachusetts Historical Commission and the State Historic Preservation Officer. So the Historical Commission and the HDC also received a letter. Both had the opportunity before the first shovel went into the ground to review that project and comment on that project.
Well, now, did your commission have time to do that?
Well, we didn't exist at the time.
That's what I mean. Yeah,
so the letter, there were a couple people who were appointed, but there wasn't a quorum, there wasn't a chair, there wasn't an active commission. So no, I mean, there was nobody to review from the Historical Commission. And the HDC, they just felt it wasn't really in their purview. They didn't have time, and they did, in fact, decline to review it, which is why we should have a historical commission. The HDC can't do everything. So when our commission was formed, seeing what was happening on Milestone Road, we decided, the project isn't over yet. The Section 106 review opportunity is over, but let's really take a sharp look at this. Let's look at these plans. I should say that there were public information sessions. So there was opportunity to to gather, to hear from the DOT, to review the safety findings, to give feedback. Also, the Traffic Safety Board reviewed this project.
Prior to reconstitution of the NHC?
Yes, this would have been in 2018, in late 2017 and early 2018. I think that there is a feeling sometimes that stuff happens under cover of darkness. Massachusetts has an open meeting law, and it has a very transparent, they've taken steps to formalize transparency in government. So if I understand that people feel like things are hiding, but they're hiding in plain sight. And there are hearings, and the government does want to hear from its citizens. So, but there's a difference, I think, between getting together in a room and talking conceptually about an idea and actually looking at a plan and reviewing a plan. So imagine if the way you got something approved by the HDC is the architect went in there with no plans and just sort of talked conceptually about, well, we're going to build this building, it's going to be very tasteful, and it's going to have shingles, and it's going to be, wonderful housing for people, and everyone's going to love it. And never a plan was looked at. I mean,
no good.
So I don't think we should do that in our approach to infrastructure either. I think plans need to be reviewed. And different, safety is very important. We need safe roads. Accessibility is very important. We need accessible places that are good for our community. Historic quality and aesthetics are very important too, and they are very important on Nantucket. So that's where we come in, and we looked at that project in great detail. I personally looked at the project in great detail.
Well, I think it was you from the commission that said something effective. The Milestone Road is really a country road, and all of a sudden we have signs pointing to the scenic view and so on and so forth.
Yeah.
Those signs came down.
Yes, so that it's interesting that you bring up Milestone Road, because when I decided, and I hope we can talk a little bit about the work with sidewalks, but when I decided back in April of 2019, there's a vacuum in protection for Nantucket. We need a historical commission. It's going to fill that vacuum. It seemed to me that this was going to be good for everyone, because if there's something that everybody who gravitates towards Nantucket and decides to live here and make a home here and make a life here, either because they were born here and they stayed, or they came here, or they were hired here for a job, we all have this common sense that this is a special place and that it should be protected. Many communities are struggling to get their neighbors to realize that something should be protected. And I think on Nantucket, it's just part of our DNA. It's part of the air we breathe. And we recognize that this place is special and different, and we don't really have to argue about that. It's just considered true.
It's a given.
It's a given. But nonetheless, things would happen, and then the whole community would be up in arms, like, how did this happen? And I thought, if we had a historical commission and we had a process for this, we could get ahead of these.
And lo and behold, there was a commission. It just was inactive.
Yes, right. And then, of course, I realized this law was there, and we could just have it appointed. And it happened, this was in April, and in May, the cycle is for appointments, so we had the opportunity to create it. But when I talked to people, I said, this is going to make the town's life easier, because we're going to flag these concerns before it's too late. And it's going to build trust between the town, who really has the best interest of everybody here at heart, and they have to sort of think about all the different constituents and come up with some combined best interests, but they really do care. And to have this commission will be able to build trust and build bridges to different communities that are interested in preservation. So I actually, said to folks, for instance, Milestone Road. There's this plan for Milestone Road. They're building these bus stops. Who knows what's going to happen on that road? It hasn't been reviewed. The Section 106 opportunity came and went. There was no commentary on it. And if it's not reviewed, before we know it, we're going to have people up on the ceiling, having a problem with something that's been done. And sure enough, a couple months later, these 4-foot square, bright blue scenic view signs. I mean, these signs were signs that would be arguably potentially appropriate for a very high speed. I mean, the speed limit on Milestone Road is 45 miles per hour max. So, maybe you would have one of these signs in summer. So that was sort of the living proof, and people did go nuts, and it was laughable. And they, we petitioned to get, well, not we, the town, the planning department petitioned to have the signs taken down, and they were taken down. I want to say one last thing about Milestone Road. So when we went through, we really did focus on signs. And we found that there were approximately 80 new signs, a total of 121 signs on a road that is 6 miles out and 6.5 miles out and 6.5 miles back. And
That's
that you
a
would
lot of
literally be
signs.
seeing a sign every few seconds in your car, including in the conservation. The signs were clustered more in areas where there are pedestrian crosswalks, but even in the conservation area, they were putting up, they just said, we need a speed limit sign every quarter mile. I don't need to be reminded of the speed limit every 10 seconds when I'm driving, but that's what this plan called for. So we did recommend, at this point, we can't speak directly to the DOT. We had to make a recommendation to the select board, and that the select board would make a request of the state to modify that. I don't know yet if the state is accepting that request. We requested that a lot of the signs be eliminated, and we used as our guide the traffic safety report. The traffic safety report actually rated the safety value of the different signs, and many of these signs had a low safety value. So we thought, if the safety value of this sign is low, and we as humans living in this community, want to reduce signs, it's a priority, then that's the guideline it should go. So we're waiting to hear on Milestone Road. I don't yet know if these signs are going to go up, or if they're going to, if the DOT will say, okay, you don't want the signs, we won't put them up.
You think they'd jump at a chance to save money, but maybe not.
Well, I know maybe by having fewer signs, they could put these nicer granite curbs that we wanted, use the money they save on signs.
That too, yeah.
Yeah.
Now to sidewalks.
Yeah, sidewalks.
Do you want to start on Upper Main Street? Because I know that was a big concern for a lot of people.
And it still is. I think similar to the Milestone Road, I mean, so the Historical Commission has been in existence since July. We've had 4 meetings. We're about to have our 5th meeting. We've reviewed 2 projects and come out with 2 letters of guidance. The other project we reviewed under Section 106 is the Bartlett Road, Surfside Road Roundabout. So we wrote a letter on guidance on bike parking, but we also came out with guidelines on handling historic pavement. And I would say at this point, the jury's still out. We really don't know if the town is going to accept our guidelines. We think they make a lot of sense, and they're based on best practices in the preservation community. It's not just us. We're looking at the Department of Interior. We're looking at towns in Europe where there's old paving stones. But fundamental to this is an understanding that really was not, I don't think it was there, and I do think it's there to a much greater extent, is that this historic pavement, these are artifacts. These are artifacts that belong to Nantucket. When you see one of these old curbs that are dark gray and are slightly rounded and weathered, it might pop out to you as something interesting and different, or it might be something that you just don't register, but some part of your brain is assembling all of these details on Nantucket and saying, this place is so different. It really looks different here. And part of that are these old curbs and the granite flagstones and schist flagstones that we have, many of which were put there by the people who built the houses and carved to fit the foundations of the houses and carved with drainage. And the curbstones themselves, I don't think everybody realizes that they're literally irreplaceable. They're made of schist. They're carved with steam tools that don't exist anymore. They absolutely cannot be, you can't make other things that look like this. It's not possible. And they used to be everywhere in New England's towns. And Nantucket is one of the last places that still has these street artifacts. Really? And I like to think of the curbs and the sidewalks and the streets as the connective tissue of our historic context, that it pulls it all together. And this idea that Nantucket, and this was really fundamental to the folks that put the Historic District Commission in place, Nantucket cannot just be a collection of, a few old buildings here or there. It's the context, the whole community of an ancient seaside town in America is what we're trying to save. And we're not just trying to make it look okay for now, but these curbs have been there for nearly 200 years, and they need to be there for another 200 years.
We've got some in front of our house, and our house has been there for about 175 years, so they're getting up to 200 years.
Yes.
You mentioned guidelines a moment ago.
Yeah.
Give us an idea of what those are.
Yes. So, well, for one, if there's historic material in the street, it should not be removed, nor should it be moved, except in very special instances.
Go a little deeper into the cobblestones, since we're talking about sidewalks and so on.
Cobblestones are near and dear to my heart.
Now, why is that?
So it was really the cobblestones that launched certainly my personal journey into preservation in Nantucket. And I found them to be a fascinating lens to look at how Nantucket has maintained itself over time. So my family has a home on Main Street. It's one of the old homes on the cobbles. When the town, as part of this priority to make the sidewalks more accessible along this corridor in the old historic district from the ferries up to Upper Main Street, the town had a priority to reconstruct Main Street, was what they called it. So we got a notice in our mail slot saying a community meeting to discuss the reconstruction of Main Street. And I thought, reconstruction of Main Street, what does that mean? So we joined together with our neighbors, and there was a lot of discussion about what to do about the streets. It was all being led by the Department of Public Works. And I will say at the time, there were quite alarming ideas were floated, replacing all the curbs with new curbs, and putting taking up all the cobblestones and building a modern roadway out of asphalt and putting the cobblestones back on top like decoration. And the view was that this was necessary because the road needed to be stiffer to maintain the truckloads. But it just seemed like where's the architectural historian? Where's the preservation engineer? These types of experts in working with this really, we have a very unusual and rare streetscape on Nantucket. We have a context of historic material in our streets that doesn't exist anywhere else. It's all been removed. Towns have removed it, and it's still here. So preserving this, and especially along Main Street where we have this fabulous stand of historic architecture, and we have these enormous monumental slabs that were put there by the owners of the buildings and hand carved with drainage channels. I mean, you can really see how the people who had those buildings, how they thought and cared about the sidewalks outside of their house and what they wanted to look like. It's all of a piece, even though the sidewalks and the stones are no longer owned by the homes. The original owners put them there. And in some cases, the original owners actually cobbled the street.
Really?
Yeah. So what happened? I really the journey that I went on. I really encourage anyone who has the time to do it. I started to ask questions like, where did these cobblestones come from? What do we know about how a cobblestone street is constructed? How have we maintained it over time? Why are we having these discussions today? The street has been there for nearly 200 years. So the digital archive of the paper is online, and my family, we have little children. We live in Boston in the winter. They're in school there, but I spent a lot of time reading. I think I can say confidently that I have read in the Nantucket papers every mention of the word cobblestone, just spending, hours and hours reading, and the first-hand accounts that come through in the newspaper of when the road was paved and the debate about it being paved, the best way to do it, how to build the cobblestone road, how to maintain a cobblestone road, and then the movement to get rid of the cobblestones. So it was actually 100 years ago this year, in 1919, that the town declared they were going to pave over all of Lower Main Street.
Oh, really?
Yes.
I didn't
Yes,
know
the
that.
town declared we're going to pave over Lower Main Street. Because, see, what happened in Nantucket is that they put the utilities underneath the streets. So they would pull up the cobblestones, dig up the utility, make whatever repair or upgrade, and then put the cobblestones back. And it's really labor intensive. And it's also a little weather dependent. So if you're doing it and the ground is frozen, the ground isn't settled correctly. So what I found looking back in the paper, back to the late 19th century and then all the way through to the last dig up of Main Street, which was in 2009, which I personally looked down on. And, I looked down from my window on it. So I feel very connected to that rebuild. But is that there's actually an incredible human story, an incredible cycle that was played out there over and over again, which is that the road was properly repaired and was beautiful, and then it would get dug up and not put back right. And it was fine at first, but then there was a slow decline in the quality of the road to the point where people were tearing their hair out about what was wrong with the road and how, why do we even have this cobblestone road? And in the meantime, the people who built the cobblestones, they were out of the cobblestone business. They were all in the asphalt business. It was the John C. Ring Construction Company. And he started building, putting the asphalt down over these roads, and people loved them. They were smooth. They were easy to walk on. They were smooth for their carriages. This is before we had suspension systems in cars. So there's an incredible pressure to put asphalt over all of these roads. And in 1919, the Inquirer and Mirror, they dedicated an entire issue of their paper to the cobblestone. They renamed their paper, it was called The Cobble, that one edition. And everything in it was about cobblestones and this debate of, do we keep the cobblestones or do we pave them over? And it was actually the Civic League and a group of really dedicated summer residents who raised money. They raised $2,500 and they marched into a Board of Selectmen meeting in February of 1919, and they said, you will not pave over this road. We've raised the money and we're going to pay for it and do it ourselves.
Wow.
And it was a lot of women.
I've never heard that story.
Yeah.
That's remarkable.
It was a lot of women, too, in the Civic League of Nantucket that saved that road. And potentially one of the first acts of preservation in America involving a street. But it's so entertaining reading the firsthand accounts of what happened, because of course the town said, well, you can use the town tools, but we're not paying a dime to fix it, and we're not going to give you any labor. They ended up, it was actually the gentleman whose name escapes me right now, but he's the owner of the Middle Brick, and of course his family still owns that house today. But he was the one who organized it, and they had to hire a team from Brockton to come and recobble the streets and put the flagstone crosswalks so you could get across. Mm-hmm. This is I'm not talking about Upper Main Street, but Main Street Square.
The wide area.
Yeah. And then what you see is that the cycle just repeats itself. Like something would happen, there would be this construction project. It would, the road, they'd recobble the road, they wouldn't do it right. It would last for maybe, 8 years, and then the divots would start, and then the loose cobbles would start. And then people would say, this is outrageous, we can't have this road anymore, somebody needs to do something about it. But someone had always stepped in to fix the road right. In 1930, it was Gifford, the head of the water company. So the water company had dug up the road, and there were piles, people wrote into the paper, there's these accounts of piles of cobblestones outside the shops. And what to do about it. People were, in extremis about this condition of having this dirt road and all of this mess. And the head of the water company said, we are not going to put these cobbles back until we can find an expert paver to put them back correctly. And then there was a mention in the paper that he found someone on the mainland, but then he went down to get the guy. He never got on the boat. He wouldn't come. He ended up not taking the work. So there was this question of, well, what ultimately did they do? Well, what they did is they went back to the John Ring construction company that had made so much money putting blacktop all over the roads and had gotten completely out of the cobblestone business. And they said, you need to fix the roads. You need to get somebody to put the cobblestones back. Because at this point, it was really part of the Nantucket identity to have these cobblestone roads. They weren't going to turn their back on them. It's pretty amazing. The John C. Ring Company found a man, Anton Sylvia, and he's actually the great grandfather of John Sylvia, who has John Sylvia's Antiques.
Really?
And he was a wash ashore from the Azores Island. And he became the man, along with the team, that recobbled all of Main Street. That was in the early 40s. And then he was joined by an Irishman, where also there are a lot of cobbles. And it was a team that kept the cobbles in good condition. And there was about a 40-year period from the late 30s to the 70s where there is nothing in the paper except praise and adoration for the durability of cobblestones. They were expensive to put in, but once you got them in, they really lasted. If you had to fix something, you just pulled them out. You didn't need a jackhammer. And then in the 1970s, they actually built more cobblestone roads. So they extended the cobblestones all down Main Street. They cobbled Pearl Street / India Street. And there was talk about more of them. There was a strip of asphalt across Upper Main Street where Winter Street was, and they fixed that because they had the know-how. They had the knowledge. I found an article in the paper. It was actually a reprint from the Charleston Gazette, or whatever the paper is called in Charleston. Charleston, South Carolina, sent someone up to Nantucket to interview the head of the Department of Public Works about how we keep our streets in such good condition. Yeah. So it's just an incredible story about a skill that was found and then lost and then found again. And now I would argue that it's lost again.
Well, I remember as a little boy, Main Street was a lot flatter than it is now. Now it's a relief map of the Rocky Mountains.
Yeah.
Up and down and up and down, and it's not a pleasant drive in some stretches. But now some of those streets, and I'm thinking of Liberty Street in particular, which begins with cobblestones. My understanding is that those stones were there under the asphalt, and they just got rid of the asphalt on that short stretch going up the little hill. Are there a lot of other streets in town that if you dug down beneath the asphalt, you would find cobblestones?
My guess is yes. There's probably somebody who knows that for sure. It's not me. But I do know that there was a very big expansion roadway project in the 80s. And they dug up a lot of the cobbles and used them to cobble India Street, to recobble India Street. It had been cobbled. So some of those cobbles have been reclaimed and reused in other places. But yeah, there are probably cobbles under Orange Street would be my bet. So my hope, just as a resident of Nantucket and a lover of the beautiful, unusual streets we have, is that we can put this cobblestone street back correctly. It's not going to be easy. I don't know where we're going to find the expertise to do this, but we have to make the investment. I think we have to make the investment in the knowledge and the know-how. What under my leadership I hope to bring to the Historical Commission and the whole island is just solid decision making. Let's look. There's so much that we can know, right in the paper. Anyone in their living room or their office can look up these old articles and read firsthand accounts of how things were. There's so much history on Nantucket that we can learn from. We should study the things that happened before and look at the needs of all the different members of our community today and make a collective decision. So I really hope that we can just increase the capacity for preservation on Nantucket, and lift up the quality of the decision making, so that we can have better outcomes. That's what this is all about.
As a resident of Orange Street, I'm fascinated to hear there may be cobblestones buried under the asphalt in front of our house.
It absolutely was cobbled, and they put asphalt down as an experiment. It was one of the first. They resisted doing it because they thought the horses wouldn't be able to get up the hill. And then they just did it. They just it was reported in the paper, yeah, they cobbled Orange Street as an experiment to see if the horses would be able to get up. And sure enough, they did.
Still there.
And it's been paved over ever since. But how cool would it be to take up some of that pavement and study how those cobbles were laid? Because they haven't been moved since they were put down by the people who designed that road.
That's fascinating.
Thing to do.
Well, hopefully that'll happen.
Yeah.
Before we go, tell us what you do when you are not chairing the commission.
Yeah, I mentioned that I'm kind of the least qualified person to be on the Historical Commission, and I'm a self-study, self-tutored preservationist. I have a business training. And right now I basically work on the Historical Commission and take care of my family. That's what I'm doing, and feel so blessed that I'm able to do these things. But that wasn't always the case. I worked for many years very hard in the world of business. I will say that I was an English major in college, and I wrote my senior thesis on Moby Dick.
Really?
Before I'd ever come to Nantucket, I read Moby Dick about 5 times, and I've written 2 very long papers about Moby Dick and Herman Melville. So I have that interest in that background. I'm an avid gardener. I garden at my home on Main Street. We have a really beautiful garden. That's a passion of mine. But yeah, I have a business background. I worked in venture capital for many years. I worked in an executive position at a statistical software company in Cambridge, which we sold to a private equity firm. I worked in investment consulting, working with large endowments and foundations for several years. And I just decided to step back from that.
That's a far cry from children. Cobblestones and.
Yeah, I know, but I've always had an interest in history and in beautiful things, and just Nantucket. I'm here, invested in Nantucket because it was a special place to my husband's family, but quickly became a special place to me. And I think as the rest of the world changes more and more, it's all the more important that we preserve Nantucket.
I agree. When do you meet? Are these meetings open to the public?
Yes, so all meetings are open to the public on Nantucket. We meet once a month because we do have people. We have people who live here year-round, but we also have people who come to Nantucket for meetings. So we tend to set them 2 months out. It's not like a lot of commissions say, oh, well, we meet the 3rd Thursday of every month. We set our meetings a couple months out. And so we don't have a regular meeting time, but they are posted, and it is a goal to get them posted earlier so people can at least know a couple months ahead of time when the meetings are going to be. Nantucket has a new preservation planner, Holly Bacchus. We work really closely with Holly, and we're so thrilled that we have someone in that capacity now. So Holly is a resource. Maureen Coleman, who is in the town clerk office, she helps us with our meeting postings, and we've worked very closely with the town manager and with the select board.
Thank you for doing this.
Thank you so much. Thanks for your interest in and giving me the opportunity to talk about the commission. We'd love to have people come to our meetings. We'd love to hear questions, and we're thinking about what should the priorities be. What are we working on all the time? So we'd love to hear from the public about what's important to the public.
Well, I've been aware of this commission for a number of years and was aware that nothing was happening, but nobody seemed to be able to tell me why nothing was happening. Mm-hmm. So I'm delighted that it has been reconstituted and revitalized.
Thank you. We're really happy to be picking up the work now.
Hillary Hedges Rayport. Thanks for coming in.
Thanks so much, Charlie.
For Profiles on Channel 18, I'm Charlie Walters. Thank you for tuning in. Please tune in again next time.